Hi, good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for a few more commissioners to join, and then we will start shortly. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for holding. Commissioners, I'm going to now turn on your ability to start your audio and video.
Sorry, I'm late.
Yeah, you can't be late. Meeting can't start without you. So where's David Byer? I want to see his background this time.
Mr. Chairman, he did mention that he was going to be multitasking with another meeting, and so he thought he would be on time, but it is possible that he is a few minutes late, it looks like.
Well, I hope when he gets here, I can impress him with my new library. Those virtual backgrounds are a lot of fun.
I'm impressed.
Oh yeah, I've read every one of those books and annotated them.
Send me a book report.
I will say David probably has read every one of those books.
No, he wrote them. David wrote them. David, we were talking about you. You have to unmute.
And then he sent us all the his write-up of each one of the books.
Right.
We love you, David.
Commissioner Byer, you need to unmute.
Jim Nielsen joining.
There we go. Thank you. I was just commenting that I hope that you were sufficiently impressed with my library. Well, I guess he was.
He may be participating in his other meeting as well, Mr. Chairman. So
understood.
That
I
may be why
see
he
that.
cannot
Thank you
unmute.
very much.
Yep.
Thank you, Ethan.
Yeah. And Mr. Chairman, I believe we have all of the commissioners and the two witnesses online, although it looks like perhaps Senator Nielsen is just joining now. I just saw something come onto the screen, but I believe we can begin when you wish.
Should be on here now.
I'm hearing somebody. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. And let's call the Thursday, July 9th, 2020 meeting of the Little Hoover Commission to order. This is going to be our public hearing on long-term economic impacts of COVID-19. My name is Pedro Nava, and I am the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to introduce the other commissioners who are with us on Zoom. We have Vice Chair Sean Varner, who I think for the first time since 2014 is not wearing a tie. Commissioners Dion Aroner, Commissioner David Byer. We have Commissioner Emerson, Commissioner Schwamberger, and Commissioner Janie Sidley. Now, I didn't leave anybody out, right? Okay.
Jim Nielsen on here.
I believe Senator Nielsen is on the phone as well, or is on the line as well, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Senator Nielsen. My apologies. Now, there are other members of our commission who may join us, who may not. Assemblymember Chad Mays, Assemblymember Bill Quirk, and perhaps Senator Richard Roth. But we do know with the legislative members that we have Senator Nielsen with us, but the others may not be able to join us. We also have our staff, Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamara Foster, Project Managers Crystal Beckham and Tristan Stein, and Analysts Sherry McAllister, Ashley Hurley, and Rachel Mattioli. Let's do some housekeeping before we turn to the subject. Commissioners' audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of the hearing. Commissioners, you may mute yourself if you wish. Please remember to unmute if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. The video and audio of our hearing witnesses will be turned on when it is their turn to speak. Members of the public will be muted during the hearing. As is standard for the commission, we will have a public comment session at the end. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during the public comment session at the end of the hearing. If you'd like to make a public comment, please use the raise the hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue. And I have to tell you, the staff is just doing a remarkable job keeping up with what I'm saying and then posting the visuals so that the public has a better way to understand. And thank you, staff, for that. If you decide you don't want to make a comment, click on the icon again and lower your hand. Those who have joined us by phone may send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov indicating you'd like to address the commission. You must provide the phone number from which you have joined the meeting so our staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requesting comment throughout our hearing. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We're recording today's hearing, and after the meeting, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to the YouTube channel. This is the second in a series of commission hearings on the long-term economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic and on potential responses from policymakers. At the first of these hearings, we heard from witnesses who described the devastating economic impact of the pandemic thus far, and who projected that a likely recovery to pre-pandemic economic levels will take years. We identified the job sectors that have been hit hardest by the pandemic and the factors that will impact California's economic recovery. Preliminary data and projections suggest that the pandemic will have a far deeper impact than any other economic downturn in California has faced in decades. Today, as we hold a second hearing of our summer series, we will further this conversation and focus on how the pandemic may have a disproportionate impact on some Californians, such as communities of color, the poor, or those in struggling regions, and how that impact may reverberate for decades through its effect on children and young people. Later this month, we will hold our third and final hearing, examining the long-term fiscal impact of COVID-19 on state government. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today and for sharing their knowledge with the Commission. The insight that you provide is critical as we consider and formulate tangible policy recommendations that can help policymakers and provide much needed assistance to Californians. And I want to advise our participants today, our witnesses, that you may find during your presentation that commissioners will interrupt. Normally, people think of interruptions as a not very good thing, but I will tell you, it's been my experience that our commissioners have read the material, have done independent research, and have questions that they want to ask you. So the fact that they interrupt you is actually a compliment, and I hope that you'll take it that way as well. With that, Ethan, if you would be so kind.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have two witnesses today, Dr. Fernando Lozano from Pomona and Dr. Marianne Page from UC Davis. Dr. Lozano will present first. Dr. Lozano is a professor of economics at Pomona and is also the co-chair of Governor Newsom's Council of Economic Advisors. He is a labor economist whose research focuses on immigration and labor supply and is also a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. He's a former resident of your fine city, Mr. Chairman, in that he received his Ph.D. in economics from UC Santa Barbara. His presentation today will focus on the structural vulnerabilities that make California especially susceptible to the economic impact of this pandemic, especially among certain cohorts. And of course, he will also discuss potential state-level policy responses. Dr. Lozano.
So, thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me. Just let me find my my documents.
Let me compliment you on the artwork on the wall. It's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just give me 1 second. Let's try again. Okay, is this good? Can you all see my slides?
We could until you went to full screen mode, and at least on my computer now it is dark. Is that the case with other commissioners? Yes.
Okay.
I get all dark.
Okay. What about
There we go.
We can see them. You're not in full screen mode, but we can't see them.
You can see them well.
Yes.
Okay,
we
perfect.
can.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So I wanted to start with sort of like this iconic image from the New York Times on the 26th of March of this year, when almost 4 million Americans claim unemployment insurance benefits as the beginning of sort of like the economic recession due to the pandemic. What I want to touch on today are 3 things. The first one is that the recession has been particularly hard in California, but that is because of longer term phenomena that had made California quite vulnerable, or Californians quite vulnerable to the recession. The second one is that there are certain groups that are affected the most because of the recession, mostly low educated, low earners, women. And the third thing that I want to sort of like bring home is that there's some idiosyncratic conditions about California that if we do not change, we're gonna continue being vulnerable to this type of economic shocks, of negative economic shocks. So, California, let me just, this already said. Since the 2007 recession, the recovery of California has been concentrated, particularly when it comes to jobs, mostly among low-income jobs in the services sector. If you look at the figure on the left, towards the middle area, most of the growth of jobs in California since 2007 were on professional services, on educational services, on health services, on leisure and hospitality. These, you probably heard last week or in your last meeting, are the sectors that have been the most hurt because of the pandemic. So in many ways, the recession has undone a lot of the economic gains since 2007. By December of 2018, the poverty rate in California was 13.3%, which is one of the highest at the federal level. There's been a reliance on contingent workers, which of course has been recently in the news because of the Assembly Bill 5. But there's 2 things in California that I think are particularly precarious when it comes to economics. The first one is housing affordability, and the fact that it is so expensive to afford a house in California. We have the problem of homelessness, that's one, but we also have a lot of multiple family households. The second thing that I want to talk about is that there's a lot of Californians who are currently excluded from the social safety net, from the formal economy, and if we do not find ways of creating more inclusive, sustainable growth, again, we're going to remain vulnerable to negative economic shocks.
Can I interrupt there?
I beg your pardon?
Can I interrupt?
Yes, sir.
This is Commissioner Byer. So I'm particularly focused on small business as a source of many jobs, and depending on the state, the sector, what I'm trying to get at is what role small business has played over the last, let's call it, since the Great Recession in job creation and its relative vulnerability to this particular pandemic-induced recession, and then acutely on small businesses owned by people of color. So if you could comment on that, that would be great.
Thank you, Commissioner Byer. I don't know the complete answer to your question. I do not know what is the evolution of small businesses since 2007. What I do know is that the small business sector has been one of the hardest hit in the current recession. I do not have the graph in these slides, but I don't remember the number, but if you, Commissioner Byer, if you wait for me for 2-3 more slides, I can show you a slide about employment that mimics pretty much what's going on with small businesses. The magnitudes are going to be different, but maybe we can come back to this point when we are at the graph about employment at regional levels.
Sure. Anybody who teaches at Pomona, I appreciate, because my daughter graduated from Pomona in 2008. And so I have a financial interest in the success of the school.
Sure, we thank your interest. It's a great school. Thank you, Commissioner Byer. So in this graph, what I want to talk about is if you remember in the previous graph where I had the areas where growth had been the greatest in California between 2007 and 2019, the shock of the recession has been in the same sectors. The first one is arts, entertainment, and recreation. Well, that was not in that previous graph, but the next ones were leisure and hospitality, other services, retail trade. So again, my point is that a lot of the gains since the Great Recession had been evaporated due to the COVID recession. But these unemployment insurance claims are not homogeneous across the population. Women, or 32% of women workers, or women in the labor force, claim unemployment insurance compared to only 26% of male. Among different cohorts, it's the youngest, the ones that claim the ones that were the most likely to claim unemployment insurance. And among education levels, it is high school dropouts, with 55% of them claiming unemployment insurance. In contrast, people with bachelor degrees, only 10% of people with bachelor degrees claim unemployment insurance. So what I want to talk a little bit right now is about the data from Opportunity Insights. You're probably familiar with them. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Had to happen. So Opportunity Insights, it's a project led by Rachetti and others in the East Coast, which what they're doing is that they're trying to collect real-time data by looking at payroll data, at credit card consumption, at credit card purchases data, and at job market data. What Opportunity Insights, what they're doing is that they're looking at different zip codes in the United States. And so what I have in this slide is that on the left figure, I have the consumption in high income zip codes. And on the right table, I have the consumption in low income zip codes. So for California, and here California differs from the rest of the United States, consumption patterns in high-income zip codes are pretty much the same as consumption patterns in low-income zip codes. if you were to look at the rest of the United States, consumption patterns in high-income zip codes observe a much greater change than those on low-income zip codes. Coming back to your question, Commissioner Bayer, it is the small business in the high-income zip codes, the one that saw the greatest change in consumption patterns. And that is because, arguably, people who tend to patronize those businesses, those small businesses, like the coffee shop in downtown LA or the restaurant here in the Claremont Village, because now we're staying at home, we're not going to those businesses anymore. And those businesses are in fact the ones that eventually see the greatest reduction in employment. So here's the graph, Commissioner Bayer, that we're going to talk about. The percentage change after the pandemic for small business revenue, it's been now up to 15.9%. And again, this is data from credit card transactions, from job postings, and from real-time data from Opportunity Insights. The other thing that I think it's really important to see in this data, really interesting, is that if you look towards the middle of the data, on May 19, that's when California had the stay-at-home mandate. But the decrease in small business revenue predates that by approximately 1 week or so. So this is evidence, perhaps, that even in the absence of the stay-at-home mandate, people will still stop going or patronizing the small business in their local areas. And if we were to look at changes in employment due to COVID-19, again, this is data from Opportunity Insights, what you can see is that the darker the color in these maps, the larger the change in employment at the local zip code. And what you can see is that mostly all the coastal communities are the ones with the largest changes in employment. Again, suggesting that it is this large zip codes, the one that have seen the larger economic shock. And the workers that tend to work in these small businesses, in these zip codes, the ones that are seeing the largest change in their employment and in the revenue. But again, what I wanted to talk to you about is that there's two things that still make California even more vulnerable. The first one is that in California, we have 2.6 million undocumented immigrants. Almost 1/3 of workers in food services or in janitorial services or in health are undocumented immigrants. In the United States, 20% of residents in the United States live with a undocumented immigrant in the household or are undocumented themselves. And what it's really important is that this is a part of our community. These Californians do not have access to the federal safety net, and they do not have access to many state-run programs. Maybe they won't apply for them because of the fear of the public charge law or because of the fear of interacting with federal authorities. But the point is that we do have sort of like a parallel economy where people who live in California, who have tax ID numbers, are not being able to participate inclusively in the economy. And that's something that should be of concern as we think about how the economy is going to grow in the future. The second thing that I want to talk about is that we have a distorted real estate markets. Affordability is expensive in California. That creates a higher proportion of multiple family households, of multiple generation households that have sort of like accentuated the possibility of infection during the pandemic. But also it has reduced the flexibility of the labor market because of high costs, because of zoning laws, and because of Prop 13. People are less mobile, are less flexible to go to a different location or to a different job than they would be otherwise. In terms of policy, I think that the main policy proposal that I want to make is that we need to expand the social safety net, the one that to those Californians who right now do not have access to them, and that includes, yes, Californians with tax identifying numbers. For example, the California Earned Income Tax Credits will be a good start. And I know that these are not tax neutral, but we need to be aware of where are the vulnerabilities of the state for in the future be able to resist the shocks better. We need to think about more public-private partnerships, like for example, the Denmark Workshare program, where labor unions, employees and employers came together to create a workshare program that will be sustained during the recession. The third thing that I wanted to talk about, or that I wanted to suggest, is to make benefits transferable across different employers. Right now, health insurance is one of the prime examples that are tied to your work. So people who lost their health insurance, their job, lost their health insurance. So we should be able to make benefits transferable and support small businesses with emergency grants, but make sure that those small businesses are in fact transferring some of the benefits to their workers. Finally, I do want to make this point. There's not going to be an economic recovery without a solution to the public health crisis. And so the first sort of like priority should be right now to control the public health crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners, does anyone have any questions at this point?
You know, I'll throw one out. I was interested in the beginning of your presentation in particular, where we talked about the resiliency of California and how a lot of the jobs that have been lost are those jobs in the service sector. And I think it showed up a little bit in that geographic slide where the Bay Area was less affected. And, you know, we know in the Bay Area, of course, there's, you know, a lot of professional level jobs, you know, white collar jobs, so to speak, office jobs. And I mean, one of the things I've seen over the years, just as a member of the business community through my company, is that, you know, we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs in California. We've lost a lot of, you know, say professional level jobs, office jobs. And is that something that is something that you thought about, you know, what could California do to attract and retain those sorts of jobs that do create more resiliency? I mean, I've been, you know, my company hasn't laid off a single person, you know, we're all working at home, you know, good solid jobs, not fancy jobs like Facebook or Google, just good solid kind of, you know, professional office jobs. And I wonder if there's anything California can be doing to increase its resiliency by attracting more of that sort of business.
Thank you, Commissioner Schoenberger. I think that's a really good question and a really important question. I think that what it's important to differentiate at this time with the pandemic is which jobs sort of like leave the state because of a natural economic process, and which jobs remain in the state or leave the state because of the pandemic itself. In particular, jobs like manufacturing, those that had left California, particularly the coastal communities in California, that's sometimes even a natural phenomena where our cities, San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, we are incubators for ideas with great entrepreneurship, and we generate all these ideas that require a lot of person-to-person interaction. Once that firms are able to internalize those ideas and start producing at a large scale, they find it more affordable to move elsewhere, where they can perhaps increase their scale in bigger plants by having a larger plant, a larger factory, by paying lower salaries and wages. So I think that a lot of like the exile of these manufacturing firms are more like a reflection of a natural phenomena, but also a reflection of the success of the state in generating these ideas, versus jobs that, in the absence of this sort of like in those economies of scale, would still be in our cities, in our state right now. I don't know if I was able to.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think, do we have like a big call center somewhere in like Stockton or Bakersfield, and those sorts of jobs, because the Central Valley is a much more affordable place to live. And honestly, I think some of it has to do with workplace laws and regulations that make it difficult for employers to establish things like call centers in California. And I think in some ways in this COVID environment, that's too bad, because those provide good, solid jobs for people that I think would make the state more resilient to what we've been seeing, with this huge loss of jobs in, say, the service industry.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Stransberger. I'm not very much familiar with that.
Yeah.
Looks like Commissioner Aroner.
Yeah.
Right. I want to thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that we can't do anything if we don't deal with the virus. And that's the most important thing for us to do if we want the economy to return. But the other piece that you didn't mention, you talked about who the workers are. They're low-wage workers. They're women of color. They've been the hardest hit with all of this. But you didn't mention at all, how are they going to return to work if they don't have childcare? Because our childcare system, and I asked this of our presenters at our last meeting, how do you expect this population to come back to work when our childcare system is flailing and that's a nice term at this point. I mean, it is collapsing. No, it has collapsed. And we have not done it. In the state budget, all we did was protect it from cuts. We didn't do anything to increase the amount of childcare that's out there for these low-wage workers.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Aroner. So when Ethan invited me to participate in this panel, I was actually in Italy, where I was caught in the middle of the pandemic during a sabbatical year out there. And so perhaps my perspective here in California is a little bit informed with my own experience in Italy. And what I can tell you is that now in Italy, they have not only flattened the curve, but really dominated the curve. And in the city where I was living, that was Turin, yesterday they had 0 new cases of coronavirus. Schools are reopening, childcare centers are reopening. The only way that we can think about the economy, yes, you're completely right. We need childcare centers for right now for the elemental workers, but in the long run, for every worker or for every parent. The only way that we're going to be able to open those childcare centers or those schools, I think it will be once that we control the pandemic. Most parents, I think, are terrified when they hear the president saying that schools should be opening right now with no conditions. I would be terrified to send my son right now to school right now.
Any other commissioners?
Sure. It's Commissioner Byer again. As we think about our task and making recommendations to the legislature and the governor, none of us, at least as far as I know, are economists. So we're not going to be as focused as you are on the data, but many of my fellow commissioners are current or former legislators. And what I want to ask is a series of questions, short questions, about data capability and analytics at the state government level. So I'm used to, at the federal level, the Council of Economic Advisors, and statistics being gathered by the Commerce Department, the Labor Department, and those are all integrated in the White House National Economic Council. And as a member of the group of advisors for the governor, if you had three data sets or data analytic tools that you think the state is missing, what would they be, and why would they be important for making policy decisions about either spending or taxation or how to implement the ideas that you presented?
Thank you, Commissioner Bayer. I'm not sure I can answer that question right now because I haven't had access to what data it's in the state government right now or not.
Let's try the question in a different way then. So in order to figure out the public-private partnership that you're talking about, it would be necessary to take a look at the amount of available capital, both on the state government side, the financial institution side, and the private company side, and figure out their relationship to sources of money like the Federal Reserve, things like that. So how can the state implement a public-private partnership if it doesn't know a lot more about availability of capital and cost of capital of all sectors who could go into this public-private partnership? In other words, the legislature, in my view, needs to understand, okay, it's great that Apple's worth $1 trillion in market capitalization. That doesn't tell you how much money they have that's available to spend or to invest in a small business loan program or anything like that. And what I'm trying to figure out is how to help the state get a more comprehensive picture of who has money, because it's clearly the case with a $54 billion deficit and a balanced budget requirement that the state itself is not going to be able to make the investments or to spend the money necessary to deal with the problems you correctly identify. So the private sector has to come in, but how do they come in? Is it loan guarantees for small businesses, which personally I'm in favor of? But right now that's at $100 million. That's just not enough money. How do you leverage financial institutions into programs like that?
Commissioner Bayer, I need to think a little bit more about that question, honestly. I cannot give you an answer right now on my feet.
No, it's okay. As the chairman would say, the record remains open.
And I will be happy to continue this conversation.
Okay.
Let me ask something, because we went past your one chart that talks about employment changes among low-income workers. And those are significant. You're looking at a negative 40.2% drop in employment changes for low-income workers. So other than the obvious, what information or should we take from this particular table? What does it mean?
Yes, Chairman Nava. I should just clarify, that's not employment of low-income workers. So what the data source here is payroll data for businesses. So this is the change of employment of workers on low-income zip codes.
Rachel Wagner.
So they're looking at the zip code, and then they're looking at deployment within the zip code.
But what it tells us is that within those zip codes,
yes,
they had a drop of 40% of employment.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and what I understand it to mean, my interpretation of that data is that what is driving the recession is a shock on the demand. Okay. There's no consumption because people are remaining at home and not going out into this or like industries.
Got it. Right.
Mr. Chairman,
yeah,
I have
please.
a question. Professor Lozano, I'm Bill Emerson, one of the commissioners. This is not the first time that we've seen housing costs as a problem in California. And I was just wondering if you've drilled down on that issue anymore and have any suggestions of where California goes to correct this problem?
Thank you, Commissioner Emerson. And particularly to answer this question, I should specify that I am answering on behalf of myself as an economist and not of the Council of the Governor, of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. But I think that there's two great deviations from the market economy in terms of housing in the United States, in California, sorry. The first one is our zoning laws. We have quite restrictive zoning laws, particularly around our cities, or in our suburban areas. The second one is Prop 13. Prop 13 has created a hold-up phenomena where the market is less liquid, where people are less likely to sell their homes because of the locking lower tax rate. The third one, which perhaps there's nothing we can do about it, but it's closely related to zoning, is that we're somewhat geographically constrained, particularly in our biggest city. The Bay Area is constrained by the sea, like the proper peninsula of San Francisco. LA is constrained to the west by the sea, to the east by the desert, and so is San Diego. So while there's nothing that we can do about the geography of California, the zoning laws that many times impede high density housing really have an effect on the affordability.
Thank you.
I believe the chairman has stepped away for just a moment. It looks like, there he is. Oh, Chairman.
I had to leave the camera for a second.
Okay.
And I had to mute myself because I got a 20-year-old cat who's very temperamental. Now I think Senator Nielsen, did you have a question?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I just had to step aside for a call from Rachel Wagner in the governor's office. He's going to be talking today at an issue that's not at hand for Mr. Lozano, but it does affect our economy, and that's our propensity to have great fires. And this is anticipating a very tough year on the fires. Mr. Lozano, you showed us some charts, but these were charts of the large urban areas. And what about the rural and suburban and suburbanizing areas of California? Suburbanizing meaning they're transitioning from basically a rural economy to now suburban economies. How about that? Now, and the reason I speak, I don't have data. We've been requesting data here today, but I surely have vast amounts of anecdotal information. And with the pandemic and the shutdown that we've had to contend with, as each day goes by, more of these little businesses are gone. They will not come back. So I would just submit, as you do your analysis, consider those other parts of the state too, because they are critical.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. Yes, in fact, you're quite right. The three maps that I presented are for urban areas in California, but all the other charts are for the state as a whole. Of course, because what the Opportunity Insights data is doing is collecting actual market transaction. The frequency and the quality of the data for urban centers is higher than the frequency and the quality of the data for more sparsely populated areas like the Inland Valley or the Inland Empire. But yes, you're quite right.
So can I add something to that? Thank you, Senator Nielsen. I think it's a topic of discussion, and perhaps Dr. Lozano can offer his opinion. But I read an article probably in the New York Times a couple of days ago that talked about the startups, right? Tech startups that are leaving, well, not even leaving California, but deciding to start up in the Midwest. So places like Kansas, Wyoming, and other states, you've got venture capitalists who are starting their businesses there. And they say they do it for reasons like the environment and the lack of traffic in smaller cities. But I wonder whether the advantages that they see in those Midwestern states aren't things that couldn't be replicated in our rural counties. So that if in fact you're going to Colorado because you don't have a traffic tie-up on the 405, but you could really have that same kind of experience, it seems to me, in the sorts of counties that you represent, Senator. Some of our Northern California counties are extraordinarily beautiful with natural resources and other things that would be attractive. So I want, Dr. Lozano, have you ever given any thought to the question I just posed that I'm not sure that you had considered before, but why would a business locate in Colorado when, for those reasons that I articulated and that were expressed in the article, when they could just as well go to Colusa County, or maybe Moda County, or some other county that doesn't have traffic and is accessible? What is it about the California experience, I guess I'm asking, that would move people to Colorado and Wyoming?
Thank you, Chairman Nava. And I think that this question is related to Commissioner Schwarzenberger. And it has to do with the fact that California has a different wage structure, a different cost structure, a different tax treatment than most of the other states. Our advantage so far has been on generating these ideas, on creating these entrepreneurial ventures. And once that those economies are internalized by the firm will try to go to places where their production is cheaper, where ideas are not so important, but production costs are more important. So to sort of like for those firms to transfer, for those ideas or those ventures to transfer from the city to the inland of the state, the inland of the state should have the same sort of like tax regime and wage structure as Colorado or Nebraska or Alabama, including right to work laws. I don't think that that's personally, as an economist, I don't think that our comparative advantage is try to play the game of cost cutting other states. We're not going to win that war. Our comparative advantage is still on generating ideas. It's this idea of California is the creative class in California, the entrepreneurship in California.
Got it. All right, thank you. Do we have any other questions or commissioners? Because we still have another witness that we need to hear from. All right, I'm sorry, Sean, was that a yes or just no? Okay. So Dr. Lozano, if you'd be so kind, do you mind staying with us so that we can hear the next? Because I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of it, we've got questions that may be redirected to you as well as our next witness.
Yes, I'm happy to stay because I always learn a lot from Professor Page.
Thank you very much. Ethan, you'd be so kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next witness is Dr. Marianne Page, who is a professor of economics and director of the Center for Poverty Research at UC Davis. She is also a member of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors and a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. Her research focus is on economic mobility in the United States and especially on intergenerational economic mobility. She's been the principal investigator on grants from the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and she received her Ph.D. in economics from the University of Michigan. Her presentation today will focus on the truly long-term impact of the pandemic recession, in that she will focus on intergenerational economic mobility and the impact on children and young people for years and perhaps decades to come. Dr. Page.
Welcome, Doctor.
Can everyone hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay, let me try to share my screen so that you can see the presentation. Can everyone see it?
Unfortunately, we cannot.
No.
Okay, hold on. Try this. What am I doing wrong? I've done this many times. There. Now can you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Now it's up.
If you could go to full screen mode, it will be easier for us to read, but
Okay.
if not,
Sorry.
it's okay too.
There you go.
Where am I seeing full screen mode? Full screen.
You just mean present slideshow,
Yeah, present online, I think.
present online probably.
Is it on the top? Oh, there we go. Let's try that.
Oh,
No?
No, probably not.
no, I apologize, Dr.
Okay,
Page.
sorry. Let me try. I'm going to try to figure this out for 1 second because I know I want to. How do I get out of this though? Get me out.
And Ethan, you're trying to just get into the mode where we don't see the slides off to the side, right?
Yes,
Correct,
I know,
but-
and I know that's better. Hold on. All right. Let me try this again. Come on.
I think you were in the right mode. I think it's a matter of,
I just don't know how to get out of this sign in now.
just hit the X, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
There's
It's
an
right
X.
up here. Okay. Now you can't see this anymore, right? Can you see my screen?
We can see you, but not your screen.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Let's see.
I think we
Share
can just go
screen.
back into screen share mode and we won't worry about the full screen. There we go.
But you're still seeing this sign in thing, right?
Is that little X up there in the right-hand corner? Right
Right.
there. Yeah. Well, that's weird. Huh.
Every time I do it, let me think. Let me just, I don't want to waste your time. I have done this many times, but not had this problem. Let's see, one more time. I just don't know. Can I go to home?
And Ethan, we do have the slides. I don't know if,
Correct. Dr. Page did make some final tweaks after
Got
the
it.
version you have,
Can you-
but the commissioners do have them, so
Can you see it now?
no. I think if you can go back into screen share and just see if we can just click on these on the first slide, perhaps, hopefully that will.
Ah, there we go. You can see it now, right?
Yes.
hey,
Okay, apologies. See if I can. There we go, finally. The first thing I want to do is just thank you for providing me with this opportunity to share my expertise on economic opportunity and intergenerational economic mobility within the context of the current crisis and its long-term implications for California's children. Like Fernando, I want to be really clear that I'm speaking for myself and not for the Governor's Council. Without further ado, let me just sort of start with a couple of pre-COVID starting points to make sure that everyone is on the same page, because I'm not sure how familiar you are with issues related to child poverty in California. So these statistics come from 2017 and 2018, which are the last years for which we have these data. The official poverty rate in the US is 12%. So that means about 12% of Americans are living below the poverty line, which is about $25,000 for a family of 4. And you'll notice from the second line here that the official child poverty rate is about 16%. So it's higher than the poverty rate for all children and adults and combined. One of the reasons for that is that children tend to live in families where the workers are younger. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward, because as Fernando said, younger workers are being harder hit by this economic downturn than older workers are. But I also want to point out that the official poverty rate, economists for some time have known that it's a very flawed measure. And it's a flawed measure because it does not take into account either government transfers or taxes. And it also does not take into account the very large differences across the United States in standards of living. So about 10 years ago, the federal government started collecting data and measuring what we call the supplemental child poverty measure, which takes taxes and transfers into account, as well as differences in the cost of living. And using that measure, child poverty is at about 14%. And using that measure, the Public Policy Institute of California estimates that child poverty in California is at about 19%. California has higher child poverty than almost any other state in the nation when you take differences in cost of living into account. Just a couple of other facts, sort of laying the groundwork for what we'll be talking about in a few minutes. But 85% of poor children in California live in families with at least one working adult. And child poverty rates differ dramatically by race, ethnicity, and parental education. So you can see here that about 10% of white children fall below the poverty line, and about 26% of Latino children in California fall below the poverty line. You can also see very big differences according to whether or not their parents completed high school or attended college. In addition, poverty rates vary dramatically across California counties. You can see here, this is actually, I don't know if you can see it, it's underneath the some of the screen sharing icons here for me, but Contra Costa County, for example, has a poverty rate of about 14%. That's actually adult poverty. I pulled the wrong slide. It's about 2 percentage points higher for child poverty in California. Los Angeles, in contrast, is about a 23% poverty rate. So why are these differences in across geographic areas and demographic groups important? Because it tells us that even before the COVID downturn, there was a lot of variation in children's starting points, depending on where they were living and depending on the demographic group of their family of origin. So the next two slides, I'm gonna just kind of brush over because Fernando really already touched on this. There's also related variation in the economic impacts of the COVID crisis across the same demographic groups and also across geographic areas. So you can see here from this recent report by a team of economists across a set of Midwestern schools that the the employment losses among Hispanic and Black families have been significantly larger than the employment losses for non-Hispanic and white families. Just for reference, the blue lines here, are the blue bars here, are the effects of the Great Recession on employment over the first 19 months of the Great Recession. And what you're seeing in the orange lines are the impacts on employment in the first 3 months of this pandemic. But the important point here is that the employment losses are largest, to echo what Fernando said before, largest amongst young families, more likely to have kids, and larger for Black and Hispanic families. And we think that part of the reason for this is because these are groups of workers who are more likely to be working in service sector jobs where social distancing and remote work are less likely. This same report suggests that about 30% of white workers are able to telework, but fewer than 20% of Black workers are able to work in teleworking types of jobs. So the next thing, this is all sort of going to be connected. The next thing I want to show you is that one of the reasons we care a lot about the high rates of child poverty in California, or we should care, is because child poverty is a very strong predictor of poverty in adulthood. This was put together by the National Center for Children in Poverty. And what you see in this figure is that if you look at the far left, amongst children who grew up in families that were never poor, the probability of being poor yourself as an adult at age 35 is only about 1%. But that for children who spent some part of their childhood in poverty, that rate goes up to 13%. And for those who spent about half of their childhood in poverty, it's closer to 45 or 50%. Okay, so childhood poverty is a strong predictor of where you will end up in terms of your economic success. And that varies a lot, even pre-COVID, across different types of demographic groups, and importantly, in different regions of the country as well. This is, like Fernando, I also pulled some of my slides from the Opportunity Insights website, which I highly recommend for all of you because it gives a lot of detail at quite small levels. This is a map, obviously, of California.
Marianne, I hate to interrupt, but we're having trouble. There's some interference on the line. I wonder if the commissioners could all mute themselves if you're not muted, and it might be easier to hear. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marianne.
No problem. And please let me know again, because there's no point in doing this if people can't hear.
It's better
so Rush Shetty and his team at Opportunity Insights have put together very similar statistics to the ones I showed you on the previous slide for commuting zones across the country. And what we've learned from that is that just as child poverty rates vary across geographic areas, so do children's chances of upward mobility. What you see in this figure is that this is showing you the average household income at around age 30, 35 of children who grew up in low-income families, defined as families who are at the 25th percentile nationally in terms of their income. And you can see that even within California, there's a lot of variation in children's upward mobility depending on where you grew up. So two children growing up in a family that has the same income level are going to have different adult outcomes depending on where they grow up. So for example, in Fresno, the average income of children growing up in low-income families is about $30,000, but a kid living in a sort of observationally similar family, but growing up in San Jose or Mammoth Lakes is going to have an average income that's about 20% higher, obviously expected. There's going to be variation within that as well. And I think all of this is really important to keep in mind as we think about COVID and its differential impacts on different demographic groups and different types of communities. Children's life chances were already different depending on where they lived and the demographic group that they were growing up in prior to COVID, but then COVID is also hitting different demographic groups and different communities differently. So in order to get a sense of how COVID's economic impacts are likely to affect economic mobility among the next generation of workers, we need to understand why it is so hard for low-income children to become economically successful in the first place. And I'm very quickly going to go over a handful of research here. And I want to be clear that this is research that's really based on very credible research designs, and for the most part is not based on just sort of correlational evidence, but is based on sort of natural experiment sorts of strategies or actual real experiments. There's really sort of two lines of thinking here about why it's so hard for low-income children to achieve economic success. I promise this is going to connect back to COVID in a minute. One is that obviously low-income families have fewer economic resources to invest in their children. This could include, things from buying them more books or purchase of nicer houses or sort of whatever inputs you think are important to producing children who can succeed in the labor force. But several of the particular inputs that money seems to be able to buy have been shown to have very powerful impacts on children's long-term success. One is food. Nutritional deprivation is very linked to family income. And it has been linked, nutritional deprivation in early life has been linked to cognitive outcomes and immune system functionality in late childhood, to children's stress and emotional regulation, which affects things like executive functioning, that's things like ADHD, and also mental illness, and to health in adulthood, cardiovascular disease in particular. We know that low-income children, therefore, who have not been able to obtain the same level of nutritional substances as higher income children, are going to enter adulthood with more chronic health conditions and having missed more days of school, in part because their parents are not able to provide them with the same levels of nutrition as higher income parents. And those differences in health and learning are significant inputs into performance in the labor market. So I'm going to come back to nutrition in a moment. The other thing that we are learning is very important to children's mobility is the neighborhood in which they live. So this comes back again to the differences in poverty across different communities in California. And there are differences in upward mobility as well. This also is work from Raj Chetty, who analyzed a randomized control trial called the Moving to Opportunity Experiment, which many of you have probably heard of, which was conducted in the 1990s and which essentially randomized families that were applying for housing vouchers, some of which could live wherever they wanted and others of whom could only take the voucher if they agreed to live in higher income neighborhoods. And in analyzing those data, Chetty and his co-authors found that the control group, who could live wherever they wanted, largely ended up staying in low-income neighborhoods, and that obviously the experimental group ended up living in higher income neighborhoods. And this led to an increase in the children's earnings of about 31%. So we know that family resources affect both nutrition and the neighborhoods that children live in. Remember, higher income neighborhoods are also going to be very much tied to the quality of schools that children attend, and that those kids in the long term who have access to better nutrition and better neighborhoods end up doing better in the long run. So economists focus a lot on what resources can buy for children. I should also point out that there's a long line of research in psychology suggesting that one of the ways that children are affected is through parental stress. So family income affects parental stress in a number of ways. There is a long line of research showing that the impacts of job loss lead to big increases in parental stress. As well, we know that the earned income tax expansions of the 1990s, which led to increases in family income, led to reductions in various biomarkers that are associated with maternal stress. Now, this research is a little bit more of the correlational type, but there is also a large body of work among psychologists and sociologists connecting financial distress and the stress that creates for parents to family conflict and marital conflict and the ways in which parents interact with their children, and that in turn, that affects children's outcomes. And finally, a group of economists have also found some evidence that parental stress affects children's outcomes. In the interest of time, I won't go through these very interesting studies, but the point I want to make is that changes in family income, like those associated with recession, can have big impacts on kids, short and long-term impact through a variety of different pathways that we think are being affected by the current economic downturn. Okay. So I also want to quickly say that there is also a literature on how recessions affect children. We know that father's job loss reduces infant birth weight. We know that parental job loss is associated with increases in the probability that a child is retained in school by about 10 to 15%. We know that it's associated with reductions in a child's GPA of about 6% of a standard deviation. Children whose parents experience a job loss end up having lower levels of educational attainment. And from some of my own work, there can be very long impacts in terms of how well they do in the labor market. One study that I was involved in found that children whose fathers were displaced have average earnings that are about 9% lower than similar children whose fathers did not experience an employment shock. And the estimates in that study are largely driven by children whose family income was at the bottom of the distribution. And that's a finding that's pretty consistent across the research. In addition, this paper that I mentioned a few minutes ago about parental stress in utero estimates, this is a calculation, that a parental job loss may increase the likelihood of purchasing a drug related to ADHD in middle childhood by about 17%, and increases the likelihood of purchasing a drug related to anxiety in adulthood by about 9%. Okay.
Professor Page?
Yes.
Just a very quick question. I'm assuming where you put father's job loss, that's probably just the job loss of any of the income producer. It's not a gender specific. Is that correct?
Actually, it is gender specific, but that's not because, well, it's the main reason is because we know less about the impact of mothers than we do about fathers. Some of these studies look at both, but one thing you need to there's a couple things to keep in mind with this research. If you are looking at long-term outcomes of any intervention, whether it's a negative intervention like a job loss or positive intervention like the earned income tax credit, you want to look at how that affects children in the labor, when they enter the labor market. You need a long period of time over which to observe that. And so at the time, these were kids in my study, for example, who were in school in the 80s. And so at that point in time, there were a lot more fathers who were the primary breadwinner in the family. And so that's a reason that much of this literature has focused more on fathers than on mothers. But I can be confident that if a child is living in a single parent family where the only breadwinner is the mother, you would get very similar results.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and I'm happy to talk about that more later, although it may or may not be relevant to the current crisis. I'm happy to talk to anyone later because I always.
It probably isn't relevant. I just thought that was just very fascinating that it was not gender neutral.
Yeah. Well, yes, I could. Yeah, let me go on because I could start getting very nerdy and talking about all the nuances of this, which will not help the current situation very much, but happy to talk about it more later. I also just want to emphasize that what we know from the research is that the effects of recessions on children extend beyond the effects of an own parent's job. You can kind of imagine why that might be. So there's generally reductions in community resources, what's available for schools, what's available for churches, community centers, and so forth. There can be declines in parents' wages, even if their own parents do not lose their jobs, they may be earning less money. And parents' stress levels may increase even if they don't lose their jobs because they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. Work by Liz Ananot and Anna Gassman-Pine suggests that even amongst children whose parents don't lose their jobs, there are significant effects on test scores when a county experiences an increase in unemployment. Okay, so, the final thing I wanted to talk about is I've talked a lot about young kids, but I think of kids as extending from the prenatal stage all the way to age 18, if you're like me and have a college student, when they graduate from college, maybe then they become adults. There's also a really significant body of work suggesting that graduating during a recession has long-term impacts on earnings. So to give you a sense of that, let me just show you, sort of go through this literature. A number of folks have looked at college graduates who start their working lives during a recession and find that they are earning less than their more fortunate peers who are graduating during a boom for about 10 to 15 years after graduation. So that's a long period of time. In at least the initial years of their working life, they're earning about 10% less than their more fortunate peers who graduated a few years earlier. High school graduates and dropouts suffer even stronger losses from starting their working lives during a recession. And recent research by Hannah Schwant and Tilman Wachter suggests that it's not just earnings losses, but that they also have higher death rates when they reach middle age, higher divorce rates, and are less likely to have children. So there's some pretty significant long-term impacts of growing up during a recession, whether your parents lose their jobs or not. So what does this imply for the COVID-induced recession? So let me go back to the pathways that I was talking about before. Obviously, we don't know a lot yet about what this is going to mean for children's long-term outcomes. So we're sort of having to piece together what we expect based on this existing literature. So the first thing that you should know is that food insecurity, this is at the national level, this is not California, has increased among households. It's basically tripled over the last few months. So this is coming from a paper by my colleague, Marianne and a couple of other folks who compared monthly data from the CDC together with a special weekly survey from the Census Bureau that's being conducted during the pandemic. And they're finding that food insecurity is dramatically increasing. And that's in spite of the $2 trillion in new federal spending, the 20% increase in SNAP enrollment, and the authorization of pandemic electronic benefits transfers. Why are those still leading to such a big increase in food insecurity? I think part of the reason is that many workers are not eligible for UI benefits, something that Fernando mentioned before. There have been a lot of administrative hiccups and delays. Many SNAP recipients were already receiving maximum benefits. So the federal authorization to pay recipients maximum benefit levels doesn't really make any difference for them. They were already at the maximum. And we know, like in California, for example, the pandemic EBT rollout was pretty slow. So of course there's lags in the data that we are collecting, but the point is, I think, that what we've done so far as a country has certainly not been enough to alleviate this massive increase in food insecurity. So that's the nutrition front. I also talked earlier about stress, and this is coming from a project, again, by Liz Ananot and Anna Gassman-Pines. Prior to COVID, they were already in the middle of conducting a survey of about 600, 700 service workers for another project. And these are workers who are in retail, food service, and hotel establishments. And they were collecting data both on employment, you see this in the orange line, and on survey, a set of questions about mental health, which they put into an index, which you see here on the blue line. And the interesting thing here is that the red line here is showing you what happened around March 14th when there was the shutdown. And you can see that in this short period, there has been a decline in mental health. This would be amongst their workers, many of whom would be parents, which really parallels the decline in employment. So I should say that these are two of the pathways I talked about before, which we think are super important to children's long-term economic chances. And the fact that this recession is leading to increases in stress and decreases in nutrition, and the fact that they are bigger than they have been in the past because this is such a big recession, those things probably aren't surprising. But of course, this recession also has some COVID-specific issues that I think are worth thinking of as piling on top of the normal factors that would be associated with a recession. So one of these is that parents are afraid to take their kids to the doctor for routine vaccinations and checkups. This statistic, or this picture, is coming from a recent report by the CDC. And what it's showing you essentially is the decline in vaccinations since, prior to, from January 1st through the beginning of April. And you can see that about the time the national emergency was declared, there was a dramatic increase in vaccinations. Now, putting aside the bigger public health effects of having more vaccinated individuals circulating and interacting with each other, if, for example, the kids go back to school, we might expect that children who don't get their vaccinations will eventually have higher probabilities of experiencing health effects that might compromise their ability to participate in the labor force as adults. The second slide, I guess what I should say is the other obvious disruption is this disruption in schooling. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on whether the kids should be going back to school in September or what that should look like, because they're too many factors. I think for me to be a person who shares an opinion about that, but I do think we need to be aware of what the research suggests about significant learning impacts of schooling disruptions. So what we know from summer closures is that students' achievement scores decline over summer vacation by about 1 month's worth of school year learning. So we certainly expect there to be an issue there. There's a nice paper on educational disruptions that occurred in countries during World War II where the civilian population was severely affected, which suggested that there were large earnings reductions later because of those schoolings reductions on the order of about a little less than 1% of GDP. And then there's this recent Brookings report on the impacts of this, projecting what the impacts of the schooling disruptions might be. And they're using kind of a standard assumption in economics that each additional year of schooling increases earnings by about 10%. And they calculate that the 4 months of lost education so far would translate into a decline in future earnings that's equivalent to about 12.7% of our annual GDP. Importantly, going back to some of the statistics that I mentioned earlier, the costs are unlikely to be distributed equitably across all children. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind right now. This is, I wanted to show this, even though I have to admit I do not fully understand it, but you can also go back to this website and get a little bit more information on it. So this is data collected for California, and it is again going back to the Opportunity Insights web link and the data that Raj Chetty and his team have collected. What I don't fully understand is what these data represent. This is information on student math progress in California as measured by some sort of online portal. And that's the piece I don't fully understand yet. But what it is showing you is that progress since January in high income households versus low income households. And the takeaway here, if you believe that this is capturing something real, is that the upper green line here is what was happening in high income families, and the blue line is what was happening in low income families. And what you see is that this is I can't show you. I don't know if you can see this. This is March 13th. This is again the time of the shutdown. There's a dramatic decrease in math learning for the low income kids, and that there's this huge gap across this period, which only sort of starts to close around the time that schools are shutting down. So this is something we really need to keep in mind going forward and keeping our eyes on. I don't know of any other data on something like this for California, which is why I chose to show it, although I'm still learning about what it actually means. Okay, so let me just conclude with some potential directions for policy. I think the obvious thing, given what we know about the importance of family resources for children's long-term potential, is we want to think about policies that are going to help with that. One problem is that the U.S. safety net is primarily aimed at promoting and rewarding work and provides relatively little assistance for families in which the parents are unemployed. This is mostly a result of the Welfare Reform Act of the 1990s, and because the Earned Income Tax Credit, which provides large subsidies to working families, is not an effective insurance policy if you don't work. You only get the Earned Income Tax Credit if you're working. So that is not likely to be, nor is CalWORKs, which is tied to work, likely to be very effective at helping families right now. I think better levers are likely to be unemployment insurance benefits and SNAP or CalFresh. We know that these were more responsive during the Great Recession. SNAP is targeted at low-income families, and there is a large body of research now showing that SNAP is actually really important to children's upward mobility. Children who have been able to access SNAP In a sort of causal sense, the program has been shown to affect their later life health, their later life earnings, their later life probability of welfare receipt, and so forth. So this is a particularly helpful lever. The problem, of course, is that SNAP is largely a federal program, and so there are sort of limited things that the state can do on that front. But I think anything we can do to reduce administrative hurdles for accessing these programs or increasing the magnitude of benefits, for example, through UI, might be very helpful. I only have like a couple more minutes, so let me kind of go through this. I'm almost done, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The other thing I wanted to mention is the potential for employer-provided support to help stabilize family incomes. Fernando also mentioned this as a possibility earlier. And that paper, that project I told you about that Liz Ananat and Anna Gaspin-Pines are involved in, where they are doing a survey of service workers that started prior to COVID, also looked at which families were experiencing large income declines and which were not. And this is taken from a quick report that they wrote in the wake of COVID. And what you see here is that, well, the first thing they found is that only 4% of workers who were laid off in their survey were receiving UI, despite the fact that the waiting period had been waived, suggesting again that administrative hurdles for accessing programs like UI have been big. But they also found that policies that helped employers keep paying people might be one of the best ways to help stabilize family income and, of course, therefore reduce family stress. California's work sharing program and partial unemployment benefit program might make a real difference here. But from what I'm gathering, there's a lot of discussion about whether that program is also sort of administratively demanding and therefore discouraging participation. As before family stress, well, my own belief is that reducing the cost of family income is the best way to reduce family stress, but we might think about things like the ACEs Aware program, which is targeting Medi-Cal recipients, trauma-informed teaching, programs like the Positive Behavioral Intervention Supports Program, which is in about 600 California schools. And then, of course, with respect to student learning, I think, as I said, I don't want to weigh in on whether the schools should open or not. I'd rather take a kind of more nuanced approach to suggest that given the variation in child poverty and upward mobility that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, I think it's important to assume that there should not be a one-size-fits-all solution to this. Anything that helps us address the digital divide should be helpful to low-income kids who are having a harder time accessing online learning right now. And then as we move into beyond the period where the health situation prevents students from being in the classroom, we might want to be thinking about resources that can be devoted to catch-up programs. And I will end there.
Thank you, Dr. Page. This is Pedro Nava. I just want to, there was one part of your report that just sort of got my hackles up, and it reinforced why it was that I was so insistent with respect to Deni-Cal, because they had been performing so poorly and had an even worse attitude about their clients. But the long-term health implications of not providing dental care to infants and children lives long in their bodies and leads to a whole host of health problems, which then translate into the inability to perform in school and the inability to perform into adulthood. And so what part of what I hear you saying, and this for the other commissioners, is we really need to be talking to the California Department of Health about what it is what it is they intend to do moving forward for this generation of people who are going to be harmed because of the impacts of the recession and the coronavirus and the economic impacts. Because one of the things that I fear is people have really short memories. And when in the future, 5 years from now, when people aren't thinking about the coronavirus anymore, there will be a tendency to blame children, young adults, and adults who are trying to make a living and question why they can't perform as well as we expect them to, when in fact the seeds of that are here right now. And if we want to ensure some sort of prosperity for people across the board in California, then we need to make sure that we don't forget moving forward the health impacts, the emotional impacts, the impacts on families that are starting right now. Because that is such an easy course for people to take, is to blame people for not performing when they weren't provided with the education, the information, and the support that they need in order to be successful moving forward. And I was just thinking about Senator Nielsen and about the digital divide, because our rural communities have such a problem with internet access. You know, maybe we need to do what Kenya has done with Alphabet, right? The Google and Alphabet, they're floating balloons to provide internet access to remote areas, so they don't have to build the towers and the hard infrastructure, so that they can still have access to internet services. And those balloons rotate out, so they're not up there permanently, but apparently Google and Alphabet understand that there's benefits to doing it that way. And whether it's for market purposes, I don't really care. What really matters is that people have internet access in a way that they don't have it now. And I still remember when I was in the legislature and the big guys, Verizon and AT&T, wanted concessions so they could expand. And part of what we talked about, that seems to me was probably forgotten, was that there was going to be a push for internet access in rural areas and in communities, low-income communities, who wouldn't be able to afford the internet that's provided by your cable provider that can be extraordinarily expensive. But having spewed all of that, let me just open it up to the other commissioners. And I see Commissioner Byer is unmuted.
Okay. Thank you very much for the work that you do every day, and very impressive studies and really important testimony. I'm an early supporter of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and I'm sure you're familiar with their work because they give grants to economists. And have actually read Professor Chetty's work and the things that you cite. So I want to go to some specifics. As we think about the social determinants of health, and I think you kind of land on this, and I just want to reinforce it and make sure that I understand it correctly. About 1/2 of the children in the state are on Medi-Cal.
Right.
And therefore, if we focus only on one issue and only on health, the strength, viability, flexibility of the Medi-Cal program is the one thing the state can do the most about. The state can't do anything about the earned income tax credit. The state can't do anything about any federal programs, can't make Congress do anything. So if we focus only on that, and this is picking up on the chair's observation, and we as a commission also had focused, for example, on mental health and wrote reports about this. The implementation of any changes in the Medi-Cal program, how much money, for what, and how well it's going to be executed will have a dramatic effect on the children and the low-income parents for generations. And so it seems like as we think about what our recommendations could look like, focusing acutely on that topic, which goes to low-income communities in rural and urban areas, and focusing on the details of implementation, it's not a question of good intentions or headlines. It's the hard work of actually structuring a program aimed at the results that you talked about from these various studies. Am I getting that directionally correct?
I think that's right. It's certainly a big piece. I think there are some things within that sort of broad catch-all of Medi-Cal, making that available is important. But I think the state needs to think hard about what kinds of initiatives it can put together to make sure those vaccinations are caught up on, for example. And that may mean more than just providing health insurance, because many of the folks who are not going in right now for their kids' well checkups are people who are covered. I mean, I don't have a statistic. I'm willing to guess that many of them are covered by health insurance and they are just not going to the doctor, which I understand as a human being right now who has children. I understand that fear, but I think there's, the state obviously has serious budget issues to face right now. But when we come out of this, I think that thinking beyond just providing insurance, thinking about the additional things that are going to need to be done to catch up this generation of kids, both along the health front and the schooling front, are going to be important.
Right. I think to pick up on the comments from the professor earlier about public-private partnerships, in the vaccination area, more than half of the information that's available online is misleading or wrong. And social media companies have an opportunity to help people find vaccination sites and reassure them about the safety of going to a physical location to become vaccinated and the safety of the vaccines and the long-term health consequences. So that's an example of something. Again, if we focus on health and we try and not use just state resources to solve the problem, but think creatively about how to implement it. In that case, it's a public-private partnership. So I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, Commissioner Erner?
So to follow up on Commissioner Byer's comments regarding healthcare, when you look at the expenditures on Medi-Cal, the expenditures are not focused on children. They're focused on serious illnesses for adults. That's where probably 2/3, if not more than 2/3, of the expenditures in Medi-Cal are. So providing services to kids actually is very cheap because they don't have as many health concerns and all of that. And we actually have other avenues available in the state of California for children with serious illness, right? It used to be called children, CSS, or well, I think I can't remember what, CCS, I can't remember anymore. I've been out of the legislature too long. But we also have other opportunities that we have never really, it's not that we haven't examined, but we haven't maxed out on them. For example, something that is called EPSDT, right? Early periodic screening and testing, which for low-income children gives them access to Medi-Cal for everything and anything they might need beyond the 32 services that we currently provide. And so it would seem to me we would want to look at how do we use Medi-Cal as a tool, because during this time, as the professor talked about, the damage that's going to be done to these youngsters, we could really have an impact on reducing it if we would use our resources better in regards to the early issues regarding kids, whether it's vaccinations, whether it's doing screenings to find out what their other issues are. As the chairman mentioned regarding Denti-Cal, which is always been difficult to determine what the issue is, because the State Department very often says, oh, everybody is signed up for Denti-Cal, meaning the patients are signed up and the doctors are signed up. But the problem is there's no connection made between the patient and the doctor in most cases. And so, how do we handle all of that? But I think that it's just from my perspective, the fact that it doesn't cost a lot to make recommendations around children's health care, as opposed to making recommendations around seniors' health care, which gets to be much more expensive and is the prevalent cost in our Medi-Cal program.
Yeah, and just to respond to that, that's a really important point. And I will also say I did not talk about this literature at all, but there are probably 3 or 4 studies very similar in spirit now, which are following in the 1980s, Medicaid expanded a lot. Its coverage of children expanded a lot, and they're sort of using the differences in which states expanded when to follow up on the kids who got access and compare them to the kids who kind of just missed getting access. And the long-term benefits of access to Medicaid are huge. And I think that a thing that gets forgotten is that also plays out in terms of revenues. So we don't think about the fact that we will have more taxes to collect in the future if we make these relatively cheaper investments today. And I mean, Medicaid is very expensive, no question. But cost benefits that I am seeing suggest it is a worthwhile investment.
Right. The other thing I wanted to point out to you when you were making the comments about SNAP, right, and foods and what we used to call food stamps.
Right.
Because what I found after welfare reform, after the 1996 statute, was that many other states, in effect, started using SNAP, not SNAP, but food stamps, right, as their basic, not self-sufficiency, but their basic aid to, right, and
That's
that
right.
their TANF dollars kind of got erased, right? They went somewhere else, all right? But here in California, we had just the opposite, actually, in the beginning, in that we had a very, what I think was progressive response to the welfare reform. Senator Nielsen was here when that all went on as well. But we didn't do so well on the food stamp side. We had a hard time doing outreach to people on food stamps and all of that. We started getting penalized by the feds, or at least warned, that kind of thing. And we've gotten better about it. But now our TANF caseload is going up, but our grants and for the first time in my lifetime, right, grants have started. I've been doing this a long time. Grants have started going up as well, which will hopefully make some difference. So that a combination of the grant, Medi-Cal, and SNAP might actually make a low-income family at least more self-sufficient than they were in the past. But it's just an interesting thing as to what happened across the country, and we had a very different response here.
Yeah, I will just say though that with respect to CalWORKs, there are still more relative to prior to welfare reform. There are still more work requirements than there were before.
Right.
And that is going to have an impact on which families. Now, as I recall, I can't remember the rules exactly in California, but as I recall, there are several years before those work requirements actually start to be issued for families.
Right, and we just fortunately, right, California had always had the maximum benefits, right, eligibility wise, and we had 5 years for a very long time until the Great Recession, and then they reduced it, and they only gave you 24 months to actually get something together. Just in this legislative session, that got reversed. And we are back to 5 years, and I believe that the 24-month rule was also eliminated, so that families will have longer time to be able to get their act together. Right, yeah. So, I mean, there's some things that are happening, we're having an impact.
Thank you, Commissioner Arner. Any other commissioners who'd like to pose questions either to Professor Page or to Professor Lozano? Wow, that's extraordinary. You have both exhausted our commissioners. I don't ever think I've seen that before. It's the first time ever. Congratulations. So let me, on behalf of the commission, express our gratitude to you both. This has been really illuminating. I think it's helpful to us and to staff as we begin to craft our recommendations, because as what you heard from Commissioner Beyer and the other commissioners, we tend to be pretty practical. We look at the legislature and the executive branch and say, okay, what do we have in place that perhaps we can nudge or persuade to do a little differently, or to expand, or to do more efficiently. And I think what we've heard today has been very, very helpful in getting us in to that place. I want to thank you both very much.
Great.
So, thank you. Mr. Rarick, do we, sorry, go ahead.
No, Mr. Chairman, the only other item on the agenda for this hearing is public comment. And then I will remind the commissioners that we have a business meeting coming up this coming Wednesday on the 15th at 10:30 a.m. to discuss both the scope of this study and what the agenda should look like for the rest of the calendar year for 2020 and perhaps beyond. So I do remind the commissioners that we have a business meeting coming up next Wednesday at 10:30. But for this,
before we go to public comment, I see Commissioner Byer is unmuted.
Yeah, I just want to comment positively about Commissioner Barner's comics and cars background,
Yes.
because he's driving around, and I want to hear some of his jokes. He and Steinfeld are like, he's odd.
Yeah, that's nice.
Or maybe it'll be like James Corden and we'll hear him sing.
Yeah, we got the maybe the karaoke.
Yeah.
Unstable connection, so I have a few questions, but I'll pose them to staff and let them.
Okay, so who is speaking? Nobody. Everybody's muted.
I believe that was Commissioner Varner, and I think his connection was not good there for a moment. Yeah.
All right, so do we have any public comment?
If I can ask the staff, Ashley, do we have anyone who has raised their hand in Zoom?
No, there's no one online that's raised their hand.
Okay, and Rachel, did we have anyone who's emailed?
No, there's no email.
Very good. All right, so that concludes public comment. Do any of the commissioners have anything they want to say before we conclude? Because we'll be talking again, as Mr. Rarick indicated, pretty soon. Seeing none, I am then, as the chair, our meeting is adjourned. I want to express my gratitude to the commissioners for their participation, to the witnesses for sharing this information with us, and to staff for once again keeping us organized and keeping the wheels on the road. I think this went very well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.